Alrighty, so we're going to take a little bit more time today to take a look at the full evolution of Japanese theater, Japanese classical theater. And again, when we're talking about the Greeks, we were looking at a time that was largely about 800 to 200 BC. The Romans were looking at about 400 BC to 400 AD. And here we're looking at largely a period of time that's roughly around 800 AD until really about the 19th century. So we're kind of jumping around the timeline a little bit here. But there was a lot going on in Asia at this time. The Japanese theater is kind of the, in many respects, the kind of centerpiece of its vibrancy. So let me be familiar with the religious philosophy Shintoism. Its basic premise is human beings' place in nature. So what is the sort of balance that nature is the sort of natural state of the spiritual world? So really where the origins of this comes from is that kind of, again, religious understanding. So just like we had with the Greeks, a good portion of this comes from the fact that people are paying homage in some way, shape, or form to the religious or spiritual world that they're associating and identifying with. So the first recorded or known element of what's called the kagura, pardon me if I'm butchering some of these words, I'm doing my best. Kagura ceremony, which was a stylized, ritualized dance intoned to accompanied music. And again, it was as a sort of ceremonial rite that was dedicated toward the Shintoist beliefs. So again, this is what would be in the Western world around 700 AD. In addition to the kagura ceremonies, the sangaku, which was described as miscellaneous music with rhythmic movement. Now, what separates this from this is that this miscellaneous music was generally considered to be a lot more frolicsome, a little bit more light, and sort of meant to have a little bit of frivolity to it. So it kind of the basis and basics of early forms of comedy, okay? But again, it was more or less a different approach to this ceremonial, ritualized music and dance. Yes, Will?
So when you say more light, are we talking about certain instruments weren't involved, like less percussion or?
I would say it was more rhythmically bouncy. I don't really know the nature of the instrumentation. Most of the stringed instrument additions that we heard in the video the other day and so forth, those are added later. So it's largely percussion and flute with maybe a single stringed instrument. So fast forward a couple of hundred years, and the philosophy of Buddhism starts to infiltrate, starts to affect and influence the Japanese culture, and Shintoism kind of takes I'm not going to say a back seat, but the kind of philosophies blend together a little bit. And we then have the kagura and sangaku kind of morphing into this, which is called rugaku. Now, I'm not going to ask you to identify on the test the differences between those terms, but you should be at least sort of, familiar that this is sort of the evolution. But this, again, was a generational dance, meaning that the dance was very specific, laid out, again, intoned by some musicians who were sort of singing as the narrators, if you will. And it was passed from generation to generation. Now, this is kind of a key element throughout Japanese history, is how much of it is hereditarily linked throughout most of this sort of 1,000-year period that we're talking about. So it was very kind of specifically identified as this is the family that's going to carry on this tradition. Okay. Now, the stories that they were depicting were often things that were either probably somewhat known to the audience, or they were being depicted in the spoken and toned terms along with the dance ceremony that the audience was seeing, that they were witnessing. And these stories are largely things that are meant to be, you know, heroic representations, or kind of like what we saw in Love, Suicide, but not nearly as sophisticated, some sort of social commentary. But from here, because this is, again, we're dealing with a population that doesn't necessarily have great access to written language. We're dealing with a population that's largely transferred through spoken language. And so, because of that, the Buddhist priests started to see how much this could be used as something that would benefit them. So all of these predecessors evolved into what was sort of the first formally known form of Japanese theater, the No theater. Okay? And along with these sort of, if we back this up, and I'll come back this again, but if you notice in the previous screen, what we called the Sengaku miscellaneous music, it was transformed into an actual part of the No theater called Sarigaku. Now, this form kind of, I'm going to say, gave way to the more popular, lighthearted Sarigaku. Okay. Now, there's a very rigid set of rules that goes along with No theater, which I'll get to in a second. That, again, eventually was transferred to Kabuki, but there's a lot more, I'll call them sort of differences of the stylistic that I'll show you here in a second. So the Sarigaku was also, literally this translates to monkey music. Okay? So you get the idea that this was kind of circus-like. The dances was sort of accompanied with juggling and things like that. So it was meant to be, again, a bit more lighthearted and a bit more frolicsome. But that doesn't carry all the way through the entirety of the No theater, as you'll see in a second. So let me take a second here to take a look at this photo. And it's an older black and white photo, obviously, but you'll notice a couple of features. The audience is kind of seated on the side in this rectangular stage. So you've got more audience out here and an audience on the side here. Over here, this part is closed off as part of a wall of the stage. So it is a covered, four-posted stage area with one entrance point, this bridge here, which is kind of the precursor to Kabuki's Hanamichi. And you see the musicians sort of strewn in the back here. Now, the nature of the staging of No theater was very specifically tied to this structure. And a proper No theater has to, at least up until about the 19th century, has to have this formation in order for it to be considered proper. This post here was known as the shite post, which was the term for the lead character. So the lead character is supposed to, and it's probably this person here, give their dialogue near and in the direction of this post. Okay? The more minor characters, the maki, were located in these other posts, the one that was here as well as upstage. This was sort of known as the musician post area. The only other entrance point was a door that's over on this side that was about 3 feet high. And it's for characters that are supposed to be dead, to appear or disappear, minor characters that come on, disappear, and so forth. The only use of this entrance point was for the main character. So there's a lot of that to us sort of like, oh, well, you want to use the versatility of, no, it has very rigid, structured definitions of what parts of the stage were supposed to be used and how. Okay? So, with that, no theater became a definite teaching tool of the Buddhist priests because they saw how they could depict the lessons, and this is something you'll see when we get to the Dark Ages in Europe as well. But they saw that they could use these sort of staged and reenacted. There it is. Reenacted. Reenacted depictions of these stories in order to teach the audience about the philosophies, about certain values of the Buddhist system. So the structure of the No Theater is meant to be, if you know anything about Buddhism, you're supposed to kind of find the middle path through a sense of contemplation of your place and so forth. You're not really, the philosophy doesn't really support a lot of emotional extremes. That is the way that the audience is supposed to react to this as well. It's in some